All right, so let's try our technique on this problem. Now, this problem works like this. Suppose there's a roofer that earns $24 an hour, and if they go for overtime, they get 36. Now, let's say the roofer puts in 40 hours in a week and wishes to earn $1,200 by the end of that week. So they're going to put in 40, but they're actually going to think about putting in more to bump up that paycheck to $1,200 for that week. Well, how much overtime should they be working? All right. So again, to understand this problem, we want to read it, reread it. And what we're going to look for as we're doing that is, can we list the knowns and unknowns? So what do we know? So now this doesn't have to just mean numbers. Maybe if there's formulas or things like that, anything that we know that's going to help us with this problem, we can put it in this category. But we do know this, $24 per hour. And that's the regular wage. Overtime, 36. Then we also know they want $1,200 for the week. Lastly, and this is sort of implied, the idea is that the regular work week is 40 hours. So what we're going to assume, unless 40 hours times 24 is $1,200, and that's something we would want to check. Is that actually true? Well, let's see here. Do we even need to work overtime? Well, let's do that calculation. 40 times 24, and we get $960. Okay, so that's not 1,200. So we have to work more than 40 hours. So, okay, so we need to work some overtime because we want $1,200, not 960. So what's unknown is this: the amount of overtime hours. That's what we're missing. So this is what we know: $24 an hour, overtime is 36 an hour. We want $1,200 at the end of this week, and that means we're gonna have to work more than 40 hours. So what we didn't know is how much overtime we're going to have to work. So, all right. So we're gonna let X equal the overtime hours. Let X be overtime. So is there any kind of relationship we can come up with here? Well, there is something we can do, and I didn't mention it before, and sometimes we realize this later on. I calculated the amount of money earlier that we would make if we worked 40 hours. And at 40 hours at $24 an hour, we get $960. So there is another quantity that we could have listed as an unknown that suddenly might be implied. And this is the money how much overtime money are we going to make? And again, this is something we could have listed back in step one. So, okay, how much overtime money? Well, the overtime money is going to be the wage times hours. It's the wage for overtime times hours. Now we know what that wage is. It's $36. As for the overtime hours, we're calling that X. So I'm going to call this overtime wage and overtime hours. So it's going to be 36 times X. Or, since this is algebra, we'll make that invisible, 36X. All right. So there was another unknown quantity that maybe we didn't catch. And this is not something you want to beat yourself up on. Because if you look at the problem, it didn't mention about breaking the money down necessarily. It just talked about the total. So we could think of this in terms of, and the idea of overtime, and even mention overtime money, it just wanted hours of overtime. So sometimes you might discover an unknown that could be helpful later on. Well, let's continue. Equation. And now we're going to see those unmentioned unknowns come into play, or at least the one that we just considered. Well, there's an overarching relationship. Total earnings equals $960. Oh, I'm sorry, not 960, 1,200. Getting ahead of myself here. So the total earnings we want is 1,200. Now we're going to break this up. The earnings come from two sources. Regular pay and then overtime pay. Now, earlier, to see if we even needed to work overtime, we figured out, well, how much money do we make just working regular hours, 40, at $24 an hour? And that turned out to be $960. So that was the regular pay. This is the amount of money we make for working 40 hours a week. So this is 960. So how do we figure out the overtime pay? Well, that was that other unknown that I didn't think of in the first step, but I realized in the second step, is there really anything else I could use this fundamental unknown? I mean, it was the only one that I had in step one. Is there anything I could use it for? If X represents the number of hours of overtime, is there anything I can base off of that? And I thought, well, you could come up with the amount of money you make just from overtime by taking the overtime wage, which was $36 per hour, times the X number of hours you worked on overtime. So we can use that here. The overtime pay is going to be 36 times how many hours we worked at overtime. And we call those hours X. So this becomes 36X. That necessarily. And so this will be the time. This is what we earn working 40. This is what we earn working overtime. And we want it. So these two add up to 1,200. What value for X? How many hours of overtime allows that to happen? So this is the equation we're going to solve. So this is a two-operator equation. We have a multiplication and an addition. Now, again, with PEMDAS, if we're just computing things, not solving, just computing, but we want to solve. But if we were just computing, we would do the multiplication first and then add. But when we're solving, we go backwards through PEMDAS and cancel as we go. Or in other words, we'll cancel this first, and then we'll undo the multiplication. You're going to get this. Last step. The opposite of, well, this was the opposite of a positive would be a negative. You've got a positive 960, you want this to go away because you want to get X by itself. Subtract 960, it'll go to 0. What we did to one side, we have to do to the other. So now we got to do the opposite of multiplying by 36, divide by 36. So those will cancel. What we did to one side, we did to the other. So we get X. Let's see, 240 divided by 36. It comes out to 6.67, or approximately that. So this is about 6.667 hours. You can convert that to, in other words, this is 6 hours, 0.667 of an hour. We'll take this, the decimal part, 0.667, multiplied by 60 minutes, and we get 40 minutes. And the way I did that, I broke it up like this. And actually, my calculator gave me far more digits. This is hours. This is a fraction of an hour, or part of an hour. So this is hours. A part of an hour is probably going to be minutes. So how many minutes are an hour? Well, 60 minutes. So you can do a quick conversion. Keep our digits the same here. Hours times 60 minutes per 1 hour. These are opposite top and bottom, so that means they cancel. We do this times this divided by 1. We just keep the minutes. But the numbers, we compute those. We do 0.666667 times 60 divided by 1 and tack on minutes at the end for our answer. And if you're using the calculator representation here, you'll get 6. This will come out to roughly about 40 minutes. So what we end up getting is 6 hours, 40 minutes. Or that number in just hours. So that's how much overtime you would need to work. So for checking this, again, make sure your calculations are working. Make sure that you get your $1,200. So again, one thing we can check is that our regular pay is $24 an hour times 40 hours. That's regular. And then our overtime, 36 times 6 point, you call it 6.6 repeating if you wanted to. Does this equal 1,200? So this is a check we can do. At least we certainly want this part to work out. So we claim that's how many hours you need to work overtime. And if you do the calculation, it does work. And the answer makes sense. I mean, we didn't get negative time. It probably 6.6 repeating probably makes more sense than like 10,000 hours. So it seems like a good answer. So we're going to go with it. So that's it. Any questions? Let me know.